Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Therapy with Ari, where we talk about the heart, the mind, and everything in between. I'm your host Ari, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a fairly misunderstood topic, self-hypnotism, a radical but simple way of creating deep change within your habitual emotional patterns. I'll start by giving a very general overview of how this thing we call consciousness is created in our nervous system. Because understanding all of this is key to believing in hypnotism and knowing that it can work for you, which is an essential step. Then I'll move on to describe some of the ways that this system gets disrupted or becomes dysfunctional. If you already have some familiarity with the anatomy of consciousness, feel free to skip ahead to the last part, where I'll explain some basic self-hypnotic techniques that you can use in order to influence the system and change it in deep and fundamental ways. As always, I want to stress that for the purposes of this short video, I've chosen to simplify many complicated topics of neuroscience into more easily understandable and digestible bits that'll be relevant for our intents and purposes. I also want to mention that while the techniques I'm describing here are fairly simple once you understand them, they require daily repetition and commitment to be effective at a deep level. And so, like with anything worth having, they require a significant amount of serious-minded effort for success. This video is meant simply to introduce you to the topic of self-hypnotism and pique your interest. So please, do more research on the topic before you jump into the deep end, because, as with any powerful tool, there's risks involved here. So let's dive in and start talking about this amazingly complex machine that we are all in possession of, consciousness. One of the more interesting facts to understand about consciousness for anyone who's looking to make any significant changes to the way their mind operates is that what we experience as our everyday self, our unified personality, is actually not really unified at all. Your consciousness, the feeling of you that you're experiencing right now, and which is watching this video, is actually made up of several unique and specialized brain systems which analyze incoming perceptions from various different perspectives, and whose output eventually overlaps to create a final and unified feeling of conscious experience. For the purposes of this video, we can think of consciousness as consisting of two parts. First, we have awareness, which is the ability to have experiences, to be aware of the external world, as well as internal thoughts, emotions, and sensations. And second, we have agency, which is the capacity to make decisions, direct attention, and to have inner goals and to act based on those goals. Many parts of the nervous system work in parallel to allow for both of these functions of consciousness to exist at the same time, including memory, attention, perception, and emotion, and more. There are a variety of these functional splits built into our nervous system, but here we're going to zoom in on two which are important for our purposes. The left-right hemispheric split of the cerebral cortex, as well as the top-bottom split between the cortex and the limbic system. Don't worry so much about the technical terms here. The important thing to understand is that there's a real difference between the functioning of the left and right hemispheres of the brain, as well as another real difference between the functioning of the thinking brain and the feeling brain. In normal experiences, these parts and functions usually overlap to create a unified feeling of consciousness. But at times, during extraordinary experiences, some of these functions fall out of sync with the rest or give contradictory outputs. And this lack of harmony can lead to all kinds of challenges and difficulties for the person going through them. The good news is that we're discovering ways that people can heal their internal conflicts by understanding why these conflicts occur and learning how to practically and effectively create change to reharmonize these systems. So let's talk about these two functional splits between the left-right and top-bottom a little deeper. So the brain's cortex, and more specifically, a part called the prefrontal cortex, is the part of the brain that we may call the human part. It's responsible for things like thinking, planning, decision-making, self-awareness, inhibition of emotions, language, symbolic reasoning, abstract thought, and more. Most of what it does can be considered conscious, and by that I mean it's deliberate and slow relative to the speed of the limbic emotional system. This part of the brain is also split into two hemispheres or halves, the left and the right. There are a lot of myths floating around about how the way that this split in the hemisphere affects its functions, and most of them are just that, myths. The truth is that both hemispheres of the brain are highly involved in processing all incoming information. But the big difference is the way in which they process this information. The left brain is usually considered to process information in a linear manner, meaning one thing happens, then the next thing happens, and then the next thing happens. And it tends to focus on parts rather than the whole. Whereas the right brain looks at the totality of the information and is less time-bound. You can think of it in terms of one of the actual practical differences between the hemispheres, their method of communication. The left brain is typically considered to be the hemisphere of language in most people. And if you think about how language is constructed, it's very linear and object-oriented. One word comes after the next, and each word represents something. The right brain, on the other hand, doesn't usually communicate with words, and instead uses images and pictures. A picture is not linear. You look at the whole picture all at once, and it often represents many things at the same time. This, by the way, is possibly the biggest and most important reason why trying to work on the emotional level doesn't respond well to verbal or analytical methods of processing, and is happening at a different level, indeed in different brain structures. This is also why right brain processes are often linked with emotions, because both of these systems tend to respond better to imagistic forms of therapy rather than verbal. Next, we can talk about the deeper, more mammalian brain structure, the limbic system, which is responsible for most of our emotional reactions. Survival instincts like fight, flight, freeze, or implicit memory, which is emotional memory, instinctive behaviors, and our motivations and reward structures, which are important for depressed or addicted patients, amongst others. This system is much faster in its speed of operation, also more unconscious, and more emotionally driven. When we have a highly emotional experience or trauma, especially early in childhood, these memories are stored in the limbic system and are activated when the appropriate triggers appear in the present environment. And they're not easy to override with the more conscious, higher brain functions. The logical part of the brain doesn't have time to put into action its inhibitions. And so we often find ourselves having huge emotional reactions in certain scenarios, despite the fact that we know intellectually the pattern that's playing out. And while the left and right hemispheres of the cortex do operate independently and can be out of sync at times, the bigger split, the one that we're more concerned about here, is the split between the upper cortical systems and the lower limbic systems. This split between what we can think of as our emotional self and our thinking self has much stronger ramifications in most people's lives. And anyway, if you learn the techniques of self-hypnotism, you can work with splits in either of these binaries, left-right or top-down, because usually the problem doesn't lie in the analytical part of the mind, but rather in the emotional or imagistic part. For example, most people don't struggle with knowing that smoking is bad for them. They struggle with the habitual, emotional, and instinctive desire to smoke. Or, to use another example, most people who have various fears don't struggle with knowing that, say, their fear of failure is irrational. They struggle with the emotions that prevent them from ever taking action. In the relationship context, people's past emotional wounds show up regularly and inappropriately, getting in the way of genuine connection. And so while outlining and understanding the pattern is highly beneficial, it's not enough on its own to help in the moment when the wound is activated. These are all examples of internal divisions of mind and emotion, not quite a split of the personality, but a conflicting output of various specialized subsystems of the brain that handle specific roles. And this is exactly where the idea of self-hypnosis comes into play. Now, I just want to say, first of all, that I'm using the idea of self-hypnosis as a template to show you that there are real and effective ways that you can do self-work on a deep emotional level. Many of these strategies work using the same mechanisms of the brain, but apply the strategies in different ways to get the same results. If you find that the idea of self-hypnosis doesn't appeal to you for whatever reason, that's totally fine and even normal. Not every strategy works for every person, and this is true about therapeutic interventions generally speaking. What I'd like for you to take away from this section is the practical understanding that there are ways for you to access your own emotional world, and with practice and repetition, learn how to create significant changes on a deep level. Now, hypnosis is simply a state of mind in which conscious control is relaxed, and the deeper emotional systems are accessible and more open to change through suggestion. It's a process that helps to bypass the critical filter that the mind uses as a protector and gatekeeper of the emotional world. When the critical filter is successfully relaxed and bypassed, the brain enters a state of reduced cortical activity and increased emotional receptivity, which in simpler terms just means that the non-verbal parts of our brain, the right part of the cortex, and the limbic systems, can be influenced with new information relatively quickly and easily. With the right kind of suggestion, the imagination can become activated and powerful new images can be created, which really is the point of the entire exercise. Powerful new imagery that works directly on the non-verbal emotional parts of the brain. I'll present the process of self-hypnotism in 4 basic steps here, just for your understanding. But I do recommend that you do some deeper research into the process if hypnotism is actually what works for you and something that you want to implement in your own life. I'll post a couple of links of useful videos below in the description for you to watch later if this is something that's interesting to you. Now, the first step in self-hypnotism is called induction, and this is where we relax and focus the mind. You just find a quiet space to sit down, you close your eyes, and breathe deeply, and focus on the breath, or a part of the body, or something similar to that, to let go of all external distractions. If this sounds very similar to meditation, that's because it is. It's basically the same process. Now, the second step is called deepening, and this is where it gets a little different. In deepening, we learn to deepen the trance by literally imagining ourselves going down a set of stairs, repeating a mantra, like with every breath, I'm going deeper into trance, or doing something like counting down from 20. This stage is essential in bypassing the critical factor and really calming the mind down. While it may feel a little silly at first to talk to yourself like this, my suggestion is for you to try it before you judge to see whether this step works for you or not. The more you suspend your disbelief, the better hypnotism works. The third step, once we've reached a sufficiently deep state of trance, is to give yourself a pre-prepared suggestion. This suggestion must be a deeply felt one. And the more vividly you incorporate your imagination and feelings into the suggestion, the more profound the effects will be. And lastly, once the suggestion has been made, you simply re-emerge from the trance state by counting yourself back up or walking up the steps again and telling yourself that you'll be awake and alert by the time that you reach the number or the top step. That's really it. It's really that simple. And with repetition, imagination, and emotional engagement, this practice uses neuroplasticity to create long-term change in your emotional world. I'll tell you from personal experience that the most difficult part of all this for me was suspending my disbelief about the process and getting over the doubts I had about hypnotism. The part of your brain that asks, is this really working or this feels silly, is actually acting exactly like a suggestion, but instead of something positive, is suggesting feelings of doubt. And that's just the most important thing that we're trying to do here with this practice, is to create a positive feeling with the suggestions. I just want to re-emphasize here again that what we're practicing is not some sort of voodoo magic. It's just tapping into the way that the brain is wired and the different functions that each part of the brain specializes in, and the ability for the thinking part of the brain to communicate in a healthy and productive way with the feeling parts. It doesn't always have to be some profound suggestion aimed at deep change either. Nowadays, I often use this exercise in more simple ways. For example, to suggest to myself that I'm going to have a good day, or that I'll just be in a good mood today, or sometimes just to set an alarm clock on days when I know that my sleep schedule is going to be disrupted. Self-hypnosis is simply another tool to put into your toolkit that, when used regularly and intentionally, can help you in the process of growth, maturation, and your general feeling of well-being. So, to summarize, consciousness is divided and sometimes not aligned, but it can be intentionally reintegrated using certain specific tools. By learning to speak the language of the emotional brain, by using images, sensations, metaphors, and by repeating positive messages to yourself when you're in a susceptible mood, you can make a deep change. And self-hypnosis is a great tool to do all of this. And it's a simple tool that you can learn to use on your own today. Other tools that can help with these things exist as well. And they include therapy systems such as internal family systems, EMDR therapy, some forms of meditation, certain types of yoga practices, and so on. The most important thing for you to take away from this video is this: you don't have to surrender to the experiences of your past. Even though they do impact your life in a profound way, early emotional experiences can still be changed by intentional and continuous practice. And I hope that this video has given you just the little motivation that you need to start on this path of self-improvement. So thanks for watching another episode of Therapy with Ari, and I'll see you next time.